everyone, and welcome to Buenos Pages, to another summary and analysis video that I admit I was kind of terrified to make, because today we're talking about Roadside Picnic by the brothers Strugatsky, which was published in 1972 in Russian, and this is my mom's favorite book, so I really want to do it justice. Let's dive straight in. The book begins with an interview with a special correspondent from the Harman Radio that is talking to Dr. Pillman, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 19... so sometime in the 20th century. They are discussing what is called the visitation, which happened exactly 13 years ago, where on this day 6 alien zones randomly appeared throughout Earth, and aliens visited, and then as abruptly as they visited, they left. No one knows what links these locations, and Dr. Pillman talks about the Pillman Radiant, which he explains as: imagine you're spinning a globe, planet Earth, and as you're spinning it, you randomly take a revolver and you shoot around 6 holes in it. That's how the zones are, and he links their positions to a constellation in the sky, in Russian the Lebedь constellation, or the Cygnus, the swan, basically, and he claims that the aliens came from there. The zones that were left behind are these strange zones that define physics, and they define the rules of space and time, and strange anomalies happen in these places. The people who were in these places are strange as well. Nobody quite knows what to do about it, but everyone recognizes that it's a transformative event in human history. The aliens also left behind objects that are now at the center of the research, so the interviewer asks what Dr. Pillman's future groundbreaking contribution to science is going to be, because he assumes that it's going to be something to do with these objects. And he also says that, isn't it amazing that Harman, a city that was in the middle of nowhere, unknown to all, is now known to everyone as the center for innovation and science. And Dr. Pillman says, I mean, sure, but to be honest, this was my first and last contribution. I don't want anything to do with this, but I do still keep up with the publications from the International Institute, that being the International Institute of Extraterrestrial Cultures. In response to the question of what do you think the most significant contribution of the visitation was, he says the fact of the visitation itself. It doesn't matter who the aliens are, why they came, what they came for, where they came from, or where they left to. What matters is the fact that they came, because it gives definitive proof to humanity that we are not alone in the universe, and this is groundbreaking and this is transformative. What also matters for the doctor is his work. He's working with the UN to make sure that the objects that are found in the zone either stay in the zone or go to the institute for scientific purposes. They don't go into the wrong hands of organizations. And the radio interviewer asks him about these people called stalkers, these scavengers who go into the zone and take out artifacts to sell for profit, but the doctor claims that he doesn't really want anything to do with them. He's more concerned with organization. The book then moves on to part 1 that revolves around Frederick Schuchert, a 23-year-old stalker who has just been in prison for 2 years because of his stalking, but he's now trying to get on the good path as well. He's working a day job. He's working most of the time at the institute with his friend and boss and scientist called Kirill Panev. He's working at the Institute Filio in Harman, and it's important to mention that Harman is a fictional place, and the chapter opens with him watching his friend Kirill fiddle with these things he calls empties. So he says that it's hard to describe exactly what an empty is. He says that it's like a shot, a very Russian analogy, I guess, that it's difficult to describe even their shape or what their purpose is, because to be honest, nobody really knows. And this Kirill, his friend, has been fiddling with these things for almost a year now, and nobody understands what they're for, and everybody thinks that it's pointless. But Kirill is genuinely a good person who believes that the zone is a force for good, and so he wants to take apart these things he calls empties, because they're composed of 2 plates side by side and with empty air inside, and he wants to basically see what's inside these empties. And he realizes that Kirill has gone very gray and pale and sad because he's not making progress at all, and he really wants to help out his friend. And he thinks to himself that, well, the remedy he would have done for any other person would have just been to take them out for drinks and to go around sleeping with women, but Kirill is a very noble character, he's a very good person, so it wouldn't work for him. And he decides, he doesn't know what forces him, but he speaks out and he says, well, what if I told you that there's an empty that's not empty in the zone? Because he really wants Kirill to feel better, he wants him to make progress with his discoveries, and Kirill is one of those people who really shines with his passion. He really genuinely believes the zone is a force for good, so he really wants to explore those empty things and their really like leeching away from his life because he really wants to discover something and he's not discovering it. Kirill instantly cheers up and he says, oh my god, that's great, he's a whole different person, his eyes are shining again. He says, let's go into the zone at 10 tomorrow. So he's very, very desperate, and I think that's part of the reason that Red speaks out. He knows that feeling of desperation as a stalker when he's constantly on the brink of survival. So the next day they agree to go into the zone and he tells them that they need a third person. Kirill says, why do we need a third person? And Red explains that it's because the zone is an incredibly dangerous place, and it's just like, you can't have Kirill, who's very inexperienced, and just Red alone. You need somebody else to basically man down the fort. So they agree on having this guy called Tender, even though he's old and he has kids, which shows just how hesitant Red is to use him, but there's not really anyone else that they can call. So they agree and they go off. But suddenly Red is called into the office by the higher up, by this commander called Captain Herzog, who tells him, okay, Red, I know you want to go into the zone, but it would not be good for you and for your future because you're just out of prison and people are watching you again. So if you go into the zone and you come out, it's not going to look good. You know what I mean? And Red understands what he's saying. So he tells Kirill, sorry, I can't go into the zone with you. At which point Kirill is suspicious and says, well, why don't we sell stuff for profit? Because he knows that usually stalkers do everything for the money. And then suddenly Red feels very disappointed in himself that he's chosen this path of a stalker instead of a more noble path, and everyone thinks he's this mercantile guy even though he's trying to be a good person. So he says, well, it's not really that, and he explains the situation and he says, if we go into the zone and we come straight out and we have the not so empty that we need, people are going to know that we knew that it was going to be there, and if we knew, that means somebody informed us, and out of the three of us, you, me, and Tender, of course it's going to be me, and I'm fresh out of prison. I don't want this trouble on my hands. And then Kirill demonstrates how smart he is, how quick thinking, and this also shows us just how much Red admires him, because it's written in first-person narrative from Red's perspective. And he says, let's make it official. So I will say that it's an official trip to the garage because we know something's valuable in the garage and you are coming along. So Red agrees, and the next day they get dressed in these red suits that help them prevent human-based issues like fire or maybe like bullets. But Red to himself thinks that even though this could sell for a hefty price on the stalker market, he has always done without these red suits because he's a really good stalker and he doesn't really need them, but sure, they're a huge help. So they go off into the zone on this official mission and everybody says goodbye to them like it's their funeral, because everybody knows that most people don't come out of the zone alive. And now we get this description of what the zone actually is. When you look out into the distance, there's a lot of these antennae completely covered with fluff and just these strange like strings and fuzziness that nobody quite knows what it is. And this place in Harmond was like a coal mining city, so there's a lot of equipment left behind, and there's a lot of lorries that have been there for 30 years when the whole like visitation happened, and they're completely brand new, so they're not rusted or anything. But they also brought in these barrels from the outside, and these barrels are dead after like a month. So again, we see that the laws of time are a little bit different here, and we see that the zone is completely dead. Like there's nothing alive that's visible to the naked eye except for the remains of the people that they sent into the zone. So it's a very post-apocalyptic kind of like future set dystopia. So they start slowly going into the zone, and we see Red's skills as a stalker because he really carefully maps out their route and he really trusts his gut instincts, and you can tell that he knows what he's doing. So he's like not rushing into it, he's carefully looking at the map, but he also knows when to trust his instincts instead. And it's their first time in the zone, of course, as newbies, so he's very careful to watch Tender and Kirill to make sure that they don't do something bad. And Tender starts talking and he quickly hits him to make him shut up, because you really need your wits' ends around you, but that doesn't stop him from drinking from a flask, which helps him calm his nerves. As they proceed into the zone, they see a wide variety of like scorching fluff and witch's jelly and cursed cabbage. So these aren't scientific names, of course, these are just names that Red makes up for them himself as an experienced stalker, knowing what they do. But it's very funny because it's these are very quintessentially like Russian names in nature. It doesn't really carry through in the translation. This book has very vivid and very beautiful language that I particularly enjoyed, and I think it's a a brilliant example of both a fascinating novel in terms of its structure and plot and philosophical content. So yeah, they carefully proceed into the zone. The atmosphere is very exciting, very tense. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the page. And as they're going into the zone, Red is looking very carefully around. And I also want to point out that notice how at this stage, he risked his life to go into the zone, not for the money as a typical stalker would, but for his friend Kirill. So he's still willing to risk his life for non-mercantile aims, but rather for good and just aims, for helping out a friend, for helping out humanity, for helping the scientific progress. He has a strong path in life, and he's currently balancing it between the institute and the illegal sides of being a stalker, and we will see how he begins to stray further from the path later on. As they make their way through the zone, Red has these bolts that he throws out to make sure that there's something to test the ground, because there's these things that Kirill calls gravitational concentrations in scientific term, but they're basically like sinkholes, so if you step into them, you're going to sink through and die, so they're testing for those. And as they proceed, they make their way first through the blind quarter, which is basically a living area that had all the people in it go completely blind, but not because of acid or anything like that, rather because they heard a loud noise, and they were the only ones who heard the loud noise, so again, very science fiction-y in its nature. And then they proceed to the plague quarter, where people's skin and hair and nails dropped off because of some strange disease. And eventually they make their way to the garage, with Red trusting his instincts, not rushing in. They make it very carefully. We all breathe out a sign of relief, and that's when they see the plate that's empty but not quite empty. So it's like usual empties, there's just two plates like this with thin air, but there's something blue inside, which the other empties didn't have. And Red confidently heads in because he's very careful, he's very agile, and Kirill follows him. And he goes to pick up the plate, and he tells Kirill to follow him, and then Kirill backs into the spider-like substance, which Red saw and ducked down, and he assumed Kirill would as well, because he's so used to being a lone wolf and trusting his instincts and dealing with himself first. But Kirill isn't. Kirill is just focused on the one thing that he wants, the scientific discovery, the good of the world. And so he backs into the spider-like substance, and it completely cracks. And at that point, Red is incredibly worried, and he thinks, oh my god, I am such an egoist, I'm going to kill my friend. Why am I so egotistical? I'm used to being a lone wolf. I should care about somebody else, not just me. But nothing really happens. So he breathes out a sigh of relief, figures it's just spider webs, like creepy mutated spiders, and they go out, and they have this tool that's like a special kind of floating thing, like a hoverboard that they can get onto that traces back the path exactly the way that they came. So they simply get on it and they fly back. It's a simple journey. On the way back, they're treated like heroes. Everybody praises them for making progress along scientific discoveries. Tender gets interviews, but Red doesn't want anything to do with this. He just goes into the shower, drinks the entire flask, and thinks, thank God I'm alive, as he's filled with adrenaline at the fact that he made it out of the zone alive. Again, I mean, Red is defying statistics here. So he goes into the shower, and as he comes out, he sees Kirill, who pats him on the back and hugs him and says, oh, thank you so much, you're the best. And Kirill goes into the shower. Well, Red hears him go in, and then he leaves, and he goes to the bar called the Borscht, which is a Russian soup made from beetroot, to drink his troubles away. Notice here how every action that he takes has its consequences. He doesn't follow up on the whole cobweb, spiderweb thing, and that has consequences later on too. Every word that is spoken or not spoken, every action comes back to haunt Red at the end. That's the message that the brothers also portray. And as he heads to the bar, on his way there, he's stopped by a couple of UN soldiers who arrested him a while back, and they say, Red, we're so proud of you for getting on the good path. Well done for staying in the institute. You're doing amazing. We always believed in you. And Red just nods along and pretends, yes, I'm not a stalker anymore. Again, he chooses to not admit to his sins, even though he had that chance of saying, well, actually, you're right, I shouldn't be doing this, or stopping to do it even. He goes into the bar, and he's approached by this man from Europe who says, why don't you immigrate? Come to Europe, come to Malta. There's thousands of places that will welcome you in open arms. Just step away from this strange zone. What are you doing here? And here we see Red's scorn and perhaps some autobiographical things from the brothers as well, where he doesn't really want to leave to Europe because he prefers the poison that's already familiar, rather. He doesn't want to live a 9-to-5 job and then go back to his house and watch TV to fall asleep. He doesn't want to live these numb, boring lives of people there. He'd rather have this brutal, harsh reality of surviving in Harmon next to the zone than anywhere else. The brothers, like other writers in the USSR, were dealing with strict censorship, but still many chose not to move away. Better the poison you know than the poison you don't know, I suppose. So they stayed, preferring the familiar and very difficult and brutal life of the USSR to the not familiar and perhaps kinder in many ways life abroad. I mean, it highlights the Russian mentality, this pride, this being accustomed to the toughness of life rather than accepting this promised banality of peace and of routine. But it is also the start of his demise and his fall, when he actively chooses his pride to live as he sees that he's forming the path that he wants, rather than live in comfort that's provided by someone else. He also meets these two friends called Goodlin and Richard Noonan. So Goodlin is this very religious man, extremely religious. He basically buys out artifacts just to throw them back into the zone because he genuinely believes that the zone is a temptation from the devil and stalkers are sent from the devil. And Richard Noonan also works in the institute, and he just asks Red how he is. He's more of a businessman at this point, he doesn't really care. And he asks Red how Kirill is, what his job is like, and Red just says that one Kirill is worth more than all of you, essentially, because Kirill is such a noble guy with such a noble nature who chooses his own path in life, who defines it, and it's clear just how much Red admires him and how important it is for him. And at this point we can also feel the suspense stretching because we know that something is going to happen. And he also, Red says at this point that he likes to work with Russians. He would prefer to only work with Russians because they're very noble and honest in their character, and they know what they want, and they're very genuine, just like Kirill. He genuinely believes that the zone is a force for good. At that point, this man called Krian comes in and he says that Kirill has died of a heart attack, which causes Red to spiral and go into a tirade of how terrible everything is and how just one Kirill is better than all of you. And this provokes the religious man Goodlin, who's also drunk. And then there's a skerfuffle in the bar and the police start to come in, so Red quickly throws an Itcher and gets out of there. An Itcher is like a little smoke bomb that emits a really loud noise that distracts everyone, and it also makes them itch, and he manages to escape. He then goes out to seek comfort from his girlfriend. He meets her in the streets. She's just looking for him. Her name is Guta, and she's pregnant with his child. She tells him that her mother wants her to get rid of the child because Red is a stalker, and because famously children of stalkers are born deformed. But Guta says that she wants the child, she loves Red, she wants to marry him, and he agrees, and that's it. Part 1 ends, and in part 2, 5 years later, Red is 28, he's married to Guta, and there's no specific occupation. He's just kind of in between things. He has lost his purpose. So this part starts with him lying behind a grave and looking at the road, and this is of course a very symbolic image as he's quite literally lying behind his grave. I mean, the zone might be his funeral depending on how you interpret the ending, and essentially what he's doing is he's completely off balance between the path of good and the path of evil, and he's already stopped working at the institute, so he's already taken a path towards illegality. And now here he is, and Kirill is gone, which means that there's nothing really tethering him to the institute. This is probably why he quit. And we see that Kirill really was like a tether, and we see this message of just how far a noble person can take you, how far a noble person can take you in terms of straightening out your life and helping you find your own path and your own purpose. But Kirill died, and Red blames himself for it. And he's there because he's trying to rescue this man called Buzzard. So in the Russian version, he's actually called Barbage. I don't know why, but they translated it as Buzzard. And Buzzard's name is Vulture because he is this horrible guy who goes into exhibitions as a stalker. He gets the artifact that he wants, and he has no problems whatsoever with sacrificing people that he takes with him to get what he wants. So Buzzard has got into some kind of anomaly, which has resulted in half of his legs being vaporized, completely vanished, and he begs for Red to save him. And Red really thinks about it because he's like, whoa, you're kind of a terrible person. I don't really want to do this. But Red still wants to be a good person, so he decides to get Buzzard out. So he drags him a very long way to the car, and he drags him into the car and he covers him, and he has prepared fishing equipment to use as an excuse, like, oh, we just went fishing in the night. He covers Barbage. Again, he didn't have to do this. He could have sacrificed him, but at this point he still tries to make good decisions. And at some point they also see this shadow that's walking past the graves and not really seeing and bumping back and forwards, and he probably thinks that it's one of the Walking Dead because the zone has just been randomly resurrecting certain people. So they get into the car and they drive off, and they drive to this man called the Butcher, who's a doctor that specializes on zone-based illnesses and anomalies, and he tells him that, well, here is Buzzard, and he takes him in return for artifacts or even just the experience because he wants to be renowned for being like an expert in the sphere. So he tells Red that his legs need to be amputated, and Red makes sure that his operation is complete before leaving to go home to his family. Once again, he chooses the good path. He chooses to actually see over a man who's not a good man just because Red himself is trying to be noble. He then returns home, where he's greeted in the garage by his landlord, who tells him that, why are you building things in the playground? Because Red has built a wooden slide. Red very politely tells him to go to hell and leave me alone because he's after the mission. He obviously doesn't want anything to do with this, and he goes off after telling the landlord to go away, and he's thinking that he built the slide, like, oh, I built the slide for Monkey. Monkey is the loving nickname that he gives his daughter that becomes like her actual name that everybody calls her. Essentially what he does is he's trying to win over Monkey's friends, because it's not easy for Monkey to make friends because everyone knows that Red is a stalker, and a stalker is a job that's very judged on. And he also wants to make sure that everybody plays with Monkey because Monkey is a kid of the zone, so she has fur growing over her body in some places. She's an anomaly. She's not really a child that people wanted. So he's trying to make sure that all the kids like her. So he's building her swings and the slides. And he's actually like a really genuinely good father. Even with all his faults, he cares for her. But the thing is, I think this interaction also, because it's not just as simple as a sci-fi novel, it shows the nuances of interactions during the USSR of the so-called authority who wanted to be authority just because, rather than doing something good for the people. Like, why would you prevent him from building a slide? Well, that's unfortunately how some people were, and this is also very reminiscent of how people treated the enemies of the state, so especially kids whose parents were imprisoned for like treason during the times of the purges and the like. So he goes home and he's greeted by Guta, his wife, and Monkey's asleep, and she makes him breakfast and she asks him about how it was, and he tells her what he's done. And at this point he just really wants to go to sleep because it's been a long day, but he knows that he has a client meeting, so he settles for just coffee, changing his clothes, and going out to meet his clients. As he goes out to meet his clients, he's intercepted by his friend Richard Noonan, who asks him how he is and suggests that he gets a job at the Institute. Why don't you meet with our nest? We'll get it all done. Let's get you on the path towards good. He silently agrees, even though he isn't really wanting to make that decision, or so it seems, and then he goes off to meet his clients at a very expensive hotel called the Metropole. And as he goes, he sees just how much the city has changed in these last few years. Essentially, it's been really gentrified. There's a lot of nice cars, there's a lot of businessmen, there's a lot of new opportunities because people think that this is where the money is, this is where the wealth is. This is like the Russian version of the American dream, and honestly we are not convinced, and neither is Red, that this is a good thing after all. He goes up to meet his client and he gets a hefty wad of cash for his troubles, and they tell him, hey, there's another thing we need you to get. It's like a little porcelain thing, but we know as a fact that he actually had that already. And he says, yeah, sure, I'll get it. And he goes off. He then, once he takes the money, instead of going to sleep, he goes to see Buzzard's family. He basically takes a wad of the cash and gives it to Buzzard's wife and explains the situation, says, well, your husband has his legs cut off, and she doesn't care at all. As a matter of fact, she yells at him and says, why did you bother bringing him back? You should have just left him to die there. She also slaps him and calls him a fool because she realizes that he probably promised Red talk about the golden ball. So what is the golden ball? Essentially, in his like delirium and pain, Buzzard kept convincing Red to save him because there's a golden ball that he knows about. It's an artifact that will grant your innermost desires, and Red didn't really believe him at the time, but the wife thinks that he did, which is why she saved him, and she slaps him and she calls him a fool for doing it. Red's very offended. He hits her back and he gets a taxi and he goes home. He just leaves her there with the pile of cash. But when he wakes up, the taxi driver has brought him to the bar rather than his house, and the taxi driver says, "You're the one who told me to go to the bar instead of my home." So perhaps he's starting to equate the bar with home and drink with comfort. A fake comfort that cannot really replace the honorable values of family. And here, instead of admitting his mistake and just turning around and making the correct decision, he embraces it and he goes into the bar to talk to Ernest. As he goes into the bar, Ernest takes him up to the office, and there's a bunch of police and UN guards waiting there for him, and they're very disappointed in him, and they say, "We have enough to convict you. Give us the money." So Red takes the money and he throws it onto the floor, and the guards are mad. They tell him to pick it up, but Red uses this as a distraction because he finds a trapdoor in the floorboards, so he opens the hatch and quickly escapes and runs away, leaving the money. He then goes to the telephone box and calls his wife first and says, "I'm very sorry, I'm going to get arrested again. Don't worry, they're probably going to search the house. There's nothing there. I made sure of it. I love you, hang tight, I'm gonna be here soon." The wife is very calm, she's very used to it. She says, "Sure, essentially, as long as you left nothing inside." He then calls his clients and say, "There's a porcelain box right here. You can come and collect it. I want you to make sure that my family is provided for. And I want you to make sure that they're safe and that they have everything they want. Don't spend money on my lawyer. Give it all, every single last penny, to my wife." Again, showing how much he cares for her and for Monkey and his family. And he tells them, "I will know if you didn't care for them and I will come for you. So make sure they're comfortable." And that part ends. Part 3 is actually not from Red's perspective, but from Richard Noonan's, who's now 51. He still works at the Institute as kind of the control person for all the importing stuff. He's talking to Dr. Pillman and he's kind of dismissing all of the things he's saying, "Oh yeah, sure, we'll listen to your concerns." And when Dr. Pillman asks him what concerns, he says, "All the concerns you just mentioned." So it's clear he doesn't really care. He's then called into a meeting with Mr. Lechman? Mr. Lech? I'm a bit confused with the translation, sorry. And he basically yells at him and he says, "How could you tell me that all the stalkers are retired because there's around 6,000 artifacts being smuggled out of the zone every month?" Noonan thinks that this is impossible because all of them have been imprisoned or they're all dead except for Red and Barbage, and all that those two are doing, Buzzard, Red and Buzzard, and all that those two are doing are hosting roadside picnics. He then goes to the bar to think about it, and that's when he talks to Dr. Noonan about what he thinks the purpose of the visitation was. And he was also thinking about what Red and Buzzard are doing, which is basically that they're taking tourists into the kind of border of the zone so that they can have picnics there and have like fun parties and gatherings. He's not very suspicious of these things, but he's more concerned about what the visitation is, so that's when he starts talking to Dr. Pillman. Noonan thinks that maybe the visitation was like a test to see how smart humans are, that they're going to leave them technology that's going to propel them into the future, but Dr. Pillman disagrees. He calls it a roadside picnic. He thinks that essentially it's quite literally like a picnic. You go somewhere and then you eat and you have fun, and after that you leave, and you leave a bunch of your garbage there. And a bunch of animals can find your plastic waste as humans, like spoons and cups, whatever, and they can never really understand what it is, and it harms the environment, but it's just there for their entertainment. And he thinks that this is exactly what it is for the aliens, that the visitation is like a roadside picnic, that we're insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and aliens visiting this was quite literally to just have fun and leave their garbage around, and now we, like these animals, can never really understand its true purpose because we're small at the scale of the universe. And they also discussed how immigrants are no longer allowed to really leave the zone, same as Red, who once considered leaving the zone, he now no longer can, because they noticed that with immigrants there's a bunch of strange things like hurricanes with people from the zone, or like this barber who used to live in the zone, all of his patients died, so nobody's really allowed to be let out. Much like I suppose the Iron Curtain was, except for this time it's not the USSR letting you out, it's the rest of the world not letting you in, just like this case with the visitation. Noonan then goes to visit Red's home, where he discovers that Monkey's now completely unresponsive. Guta confesses that nobody quite knows what's wrong with her. Her DNA is now no longer human, she's completely covered in fur. In a cruel joke, she's now quite literally a monkey. Red returns home, and they don't discuss that Noonan likely betrayed him, perhaps for Noonan's own safety, but he did provide for Red's family when he was gone, so Red forgives him, nobody mentions it, and Guta makes Noonan's favorite salad, and they sit down to have a drink. At this point, we also see that Red's father is one of the Walking Dead, those who return from the dead, but Red is very tender towards him. He's not letting anyone take him away, and he's really treating him as his father, as a second chance. But we see that the Zone is now quite literally invading Red's life. It's not Red going into the Zone, it's the Zone coming to Red. And the monkey and Red's father, they communicate through these wailing cries, and it's very, very eerie, and it's like you can hear all of their pain expressed through this cry, and it's like very not human. And Red is having a lot of stress, and he's really not quite himself after all. Part 4 is titled Redrick Schuhart, 31 years old. He is no longer described further than that, because this part starts with him going into the Zone with Arthur Buzzard, Buzzard's son. So Red has decided to finally listen to Buzzard. He finally gives in to the temptation, and he goes into the Zone to look for this golden ball that's going to grant his desires. And Buzzard has also told him that if he brings the golden ball back, he doesn't have to work ever again. He can retire. So he goes off into the Zone, and he's thinking to himself, this Arthur boy is a good boy. He has the skills to be a stalker. He listens to me instantly. The only thing is he's a fool for bringing a gun, because there's nothing that can save us. And so they go into this Zone, and he starts thinking to himself how pointless this really is, and how much of his life he has given to all these pointless expeditions, and suddenly they get caught into this fire anomaly. And what you have to do is you have to lie down, and you have to feel the pain, and you have to not run away. But Arthur doesn't listen, and he bolts because he's really scared, and it's his first time. And instead of letting him go, or letting him run and letting him die, Red saves him. He's still a good person at this point. He holds him down, and the two lie there for what feels like hours as the scorching pain burns them. Because instead of just lying down, the anomaly is now 10 times worse, because they tried to run away and they moved. And he's now slowly becoming obsessed with the ball, just as Buzzard is. And I think his transformation is really highlighted when, after the anomaly, after these hours and hours of torture, he realizes that he saved Arthur not because he wanted to be a good person, but because he realizes that Arthur is a tool, and Buzzard has sent his own son to die, because essentially somebody needs to be there like a minesweeper to clear the paths, to go towards the golden ball, and that's going to be Arthur. And he looks, and so they start walking, and Arthur is so thankful that he saved him, and inside all Red is thinking, get to the ball, make the profit, save my daughter. And so they go ahead, and suddenly there's this green sludge, and Red looks at it and he thinks, that's me. This sludge is what I have become. And he realizes that he's been manipulated so many times, and this entire trip is just for somebody else's desires rather than his. And once he looks at the sludge and realizes that it's him, he makes a decision that he's willing to use Arthur as the master key, as the ultimate sacrifice. And suddenly they see the ball, and Arthur strips naked and runs towards the ball with no regard, screaming, happiness for all, free, no one leaves unsatisfied. And then he's lifted into the air by an anomaly called the meat grinder and killed. Red sinks into the ground and has a drink and looks at this scene and thinks about what his life has become. And he knows that because the meat grinder has taken Arthur, he can now walk ahead freely and he can get to the ball. But he realizes that he no longer knows what he wants. The Zone is the one that provides for him, but the Zone is also the sole thing that has taken everything away. And he realizes that he no longer has any desires, but that of the sacrificed person. He lost his life when he has chosen to tread this path towards money and to go further into the Zone, when all reason told him to stay away. And now he realizes that people don't really know what happiness is, that it's a false value, a false promise decided by someone else, because those who have happiness never know that they do, and they're always looking for more. And those who don't have happiness are obsessed with the idea of finding someone else's idea of happiness. And this shows just how much he strays from the path after one action after another and after another, after he believed that he could achieve happiness just by being wealthy. He lost Kirill, the person who was leading him towards the good path. He then watched his daughter transform because of the consequences of his own actions. He could have just had a stable job. He could have just had a child, a healthy child with Guta, and now he realizes that he's doing all of this to save Monkey. But what's the point if it's his own actions that have caused Monkey to be like this? And then his father returns, and it's an ultimate reminder that, like, look, even your long dead father can no longer rest in peace because of what you have done as a stalker, as something that you started for profit. At the end, he's a lost man with no spiritual values, and he realizes that he has become like the vulture when he approaches the ball because he has let a man be sacrificed. He spirals, realizing that he's like the animal that found the trash left behind by the aliens. He has never really done anything for himself, and when he's approaching the ball, he doesn't really know what desires he wants anymore. All he hears is happiness for all, free, no one leaves unsatisfied. We don't know how it ends up, how the book ends, because this is the last phrase. This is all we hear. Everyone decides for themselves whether he lived or died. But still, it's a recognition of the difficulty and futility of looking for happiness where somebody else is suggesting that happiness to you, something that the golden ball might not even help you with. But still, the fact that Red wants this shows that even as a completely destroyed by society individual, he still wants happiness for all. He in the end, he realizes the importance of eternal values rather than short-term ones. He can still sincerely wish for happiness, and just maybe it came true. And the brothers urge us to not look for futile things, but to focus on becoming an individual that we're proud of, an individual that we want to be, and that maybe, just maybe, we'll have our own versions of the golden ball after all. This has been Roadside Picnic. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.